You know, the most striking truth about microcontrol cues is that the most absolute forms of psychological dominance, they're never achieved through these grand gestures of authority.
No, it happens through the relentless accumulation of tiny, seemingly insignificant adjustments to your daily behavior. We're all taught to think that control is loud, right? It's a slam door, a direct order, something you can point to. But honestly, that's just not how the most effective, most insidious forms of psychological containment really work.
Instead, it's this quiet, slow burn campaign. We assume control looks like a shout or a threat, but in these really high-pressure dynamics, it's your own biological drive for harmony, for peace, that gets used against you. It turns a simple sigh, a look, or even a tiny delay in a text response into an invisible fence that keeps your personality locked in a cage. Each one of these is like a little paper cut, too small to protest on its own, but 1,000 of them? Well, that can leave your sense of self just bleeding out.
And this right here, this brings us to the central, absolutely maddening question at the heart of this whole dynamic. How is it possible to feel so trapped by someone who has never actually laid down a single rule? How do you end up losing yourself without a fight, without a single shot ever being fired? It feels like some kind of magic trick, but it's not magic at all. It's a system.
This is what we call the paradox of friction-based conditioning. It's that precise moment when your desire for a smooth day, something we all want, gets twisted into the very mechanism of your own psychological containment. Your healthy, innate need for a peaceful environment becomes the leverage used to quietly manage your behavior, your choices, and in the end, your entire identity.
Okay, so let's dive into this. We're going to break this system down piece by piece. First up, we're going to examine the invisible cage itself. Then we'll get into the language of control, giving names to these tactics. After that, we'll expose the 3-step takedown that makes it all tick. We'll also look at the psychology behind it, and finally, I'm going to give you a toolkit for awareness so you can start reclaiming your own inner space. All right, first things first, it's so important to understand that we are not here to diagnose anyone's intentions, okay? We're not saying someone is malicious or not. We are simply observing a pattern, a system of interaction, and the powerful effect it has on the human brain. Think of this as being about mechanics, not motives.
And this is the foundational illusion that makes the whole thing work. The system thrives by creating this low-grade, constant state of tension, a kind of ambient stress. The air just feels heavy, but you can't quite put your finger on why. And because that stress is so subtle and so pervasive, your brain, which is desperately trying to find a cause, gets nudged into a simple but devastating conclusion. It must be me. I'm just being too sensitive. I'm reading into things. But the reality is, your brain isn't being oversensitive at all. It's accurately detecting a really sophisticated form of social engineering.
So let's give these feelings a name, because to see the cage, you first have to understand its language. These aren't just some vague feelings of being on edge. They are specific, definable tactics, and naming them is the very first step to seeing them clearly. Okay, so the primary tool here is what's called sub-threshold signaling. Think of these as cues designed to fly right under the radar of your conscious logical mind and speak directly to your brain's primal threat detection system. See, a direct command like, "Don't see that friend," well, you can argue with that, but how do you argue with a sigh when you mention that friend's name, or the specific way a coffee mug gets slammed down on a table? You can't. These signals are literally designed to be deniable, influencing your behavior while giving you nothing concrete to push back against. And that leads us right into the system's most ingenious defense mechanism, the petty trap. You feel the sting of the signal, you sense the disapproval, but the moment you even think about bringing it up, your own mind stops you. You think, am I really going to start a fight over a sigh? I'll sound absolutely crazy. I'll seem so petty. And that internal checkmate right there ensures the behavior continues, completely unchallenged, while you start to seriously question your own grip on reality. So what's the result of all this constant signaling and being unable to address it? It's a state we call hypervigilant compliance. This is that all too familiar feeling of walking on eggshells. And it's so much more than just being polite, it's a state of high alert. Your brain's social navigation system is running on overdrive, just burning through cognitive energy as you're constantly scanning for threats and pre-calculating every single word, every choice, just to avoid triggering the look, or the tone, or the vibe.
This slide really just lays out the fundamental shift that happens inside you. You go from being an active being, someone who trusts their gut, shares their good news, and just expresses themselves authentically, to a state of passive adjusting. You find yourself dropping a perfectly valid point in a conversation,
or deciding not to mention something great that happened to you, or changing your plans, all just to keep the vibe in the room stable. You basically become the unpaid, unacknowledged atmospheric regulator for someone else's comfort.
And what this all means is that these seemingly insignificant actions become incredibly powerful weapons. A sigh is no longer just a sigh. It becomes a tool that leverages your own empathy against you. Your brain is hardwired for social connection. You hear that sigh of disapproval and your deep-seated biological need for harmony kicks in. So you automatically adjust your behavior to make it stop. Your own empathy gets weaponized and turned into a leash.
So now that we've got the language down, we can pull back the curtain and expose the mechanism itself, because this isn't random, it's a process. It follows a predictable, three-stage pattern of behavioral management. This is the engine of friction-based conditioning, and really understanding this pattern is the key to dismantling its power over you. So here it is, the sequence in its simplest form. It starts with their vibe, the atmosphere they create. That atmosphere then triggers an adjustment from you. And your repeated adjustments over and over ultimately lead to your own lock-in, where you start doing the work of the controller for them. Let's break down exactly how each step works.
Okay, step 1 is the atmospheric setup. The controller establishes a baseline of high friction. Their mood becomes this unpredictable weather system in the room that you feel like you have to constantly check. Step 2 is the micro-punishment. When you do something they don't like, you don't get an argument. You get a sub-threshold signal, a cold tone, a sharp look, a sudden silence. This is a form of negative reinforcement that triggers a really deep biological fear of social exclusion. And finally, the most insidious step of all, self-pruning consolidation. Your brain, desperate to avoid the pain of that micro-punishment, starts to pre-edit your life. You stop mentioning the friend, you don't suggest the restaurant, you don't wear the outfit. Not because you were told not to, but because you learn that it's just easier this way. You do the forbidding for them.
This three-step cycle is a really powerful form of operant conditioning. It systematically rewires your brain's reward system. Conforming, making the right choice, is rewarded with a lack of friction, which your brain registers as safety. But expressing your own individualism, well, that gets punished with friction, which your brain registers as a threat. And over time, this conditioning creates a state of high suggestibility and leads to what's called identity erosion. You become so focused on managing their reactions that you completely lose track of your own.
So let's look at the psychology behind this for a second. Why does this dynamic even exist in the first place? It doesn't just come from nowhere, it's often fueled by a fundamental clash between two very different but equally powerful psychological needs.
So on one side, you have the controller, who is often driven by this powerful need for total environmental predictability. They might have a really low tolerance for uncertainty, and controlling the vibe lets them control your actions without ever having to set a rule or be held accountable. It's a kind of implicit social regulation. They regulate their own internal anxiety by managing you. And on the other side, the target's vulnerability is often a deep conditioned need for relational harmony. Maybe you're highly empathetic, or you've learned that keeping the peace is the most important thing. This clash, one person's need for control and another's need for harmony, it creates the perfect storm for microcontrol.
So what do you do about it? Well, the path out isn't about some dramatic confrontation. It actually begins with quiet awareness. It's about reclaiming your own psychological territory. It's about moving from that state of hypervigilant compliance to what we could call atmospheric sovereignty. That state where you own your internal weather, no matter what the forecast is outside. So let's look at a few tools to help you begin that process of just recognizing and labeling what's going on.
The first tool is a private one you can use anytime, the friction audit. This isn't about accusation, it's about honest self-observation. You're just gathering data. Ask yourself these questions here on the slide. Am I editing myself out of fear, or am I doing it out of love? Is what I'm calling harmony in this relationship actually just my compliance? The goal here is not to start a fight, but simply to recognize the pattern in your own behavior and to validate your own feelings.
Okay, the next step is a small, private experiment called boundary variance awareness. And again, this is not about provocation. It's purely for information gathering. Choose one tiny, totally low-stakes thing you would normally self-prune, like mentioning a movie you liked or humming a song, and just don't prune it. Then, become a neutral scientist and just observe what happens. Does the vibe shift? Is there a sigh? The goal is to prove to your own nervous system that your anxiety is a real and valid response to these external signals.
And this brings us to a crucial cognitive shift. This sentence right here can be the thing that starts to break the cycle. You have to internalize this. The vibe is their responsibility, not mine. You are responsible for your actions and your words, sure, but you are not responsible for managing another adult's internal emotional state. Just recognizing that truth begins to interrupt that neurochemical cycle of compliance. It allows you to reclaim your role as an actor in your own life, not just a manager of someone else's.
In the end, what this entire system really teaches us is that the very things we dismiss as petty are often the levers of control. Real peace, true relational harmony, never requires you to shrink or to self-edit or to hide your personality. The moment you realize that you do not have to fix the vibe to be safe, that's the moment you start to walk free. Because if it's small enough to ignore, it's big enough to control you.